Mark.
Thanks, Jean. Well, I'm placed between two proper experts, so I thought rather than do anything else, I could say a little bit about language, really. I wanted to find a link to 1939 and also a link to Orwell. In January 1939, this little book was published as a Penguin special. That was in the days when Penguin specials, by the way, used to sell 250,000 copies. So their appearances were real events. And this one, called simply, this one was published by a movement called Observation, which was started in 1937 by some young poets and anthropologists and artists who believed that the activity and views of most British people, of ordinary people, the working class, were not being reported in the press or the radio, nor were they being experienced or learned at first hand by the middle classes, let alone the elites that were running the country. So during the Czechoslovak crisis, in the second half of 1938, this movement, numbering hundreds of people, monitored the attitudes of ordinary people throughout the country to try and see what they were making of this historic moment. And their main finding, really, their first finding, was that most people had only the very, very foggiest idea of what was going on at all. And that was because Chamberlain and the cabinet were not explaining what was going on, and the journalists were not exposing that failure to explain. The report quotes approvingly from an article about this failure, which was published in the BBC magazine, The Listener. And the article said, among other things, "Surely it should be possible to broadcast even one talk explaining as simply as possible the facts about the Czechoslovakian problem. Isn't this where broadcasting should come to our help at a time when each individual is called upon to make up his mind on vital matters and to come to a decision, the consequences of which are unpredictable?" Now, it strikes me that this chimes or tolls all too clearly with a view which I assume is widely shared today, though there are no longer any mass observers to test the assumption, that the nation's editors and journalists have rather badly let us down over the developments in the financial services over the past decade or so. I have recently heard someone I've known for a long time, a mild-mannered person, who recently resigned from one of the Canary Wharf giants that teetered on the brink of collapse last autumn. And he was confiding that, of course, the financial services industry has long ago become a smash-and-grab raid on the taxpayer. Now, I don't want to claim that the specialised jargon, the economic jargon, which was blindly swallowed and relayed by journalists, was the only reason why, as the Queen so neatly put it, nobody saw the crisis coming. But it seems very likely that it was an important reason behind this terrible surprise. I think Orwell would not have been at all surprised that the financial services insiders wanted to keep their specialised knowledge to themselves, even when this masked an ignorance of what they were doing themselves, or especially then. But I believe he would have been amazed that all these decades on, the communications professionals had failed to illuminate that mystery for the rest of us. The other passage from 1939 that I want to mention makes the same point, really. The writer William Empson was making his way back from China to Britain in autumn 1939. Empson, by the way, was an occasional mass observer himself. And he wanted to do his bit for Britain in the war. He would soon end up in the BBC working alongside Orwell, and they became good friends. When he reached New York, because he was going that way round to get from China to Britain, he had to, he ran out of money, and the poet Auden lent him the fare home. But before he took the ship home, he gave a lecture at Princeton in which he criticised what he called this new and alarming disease of filling the whole of your sentence with diffuse intellectual terminology. Now, the root of this disease, Empson said, and I'm quoting again, is a failure to keep the normal living connection between the written language and the spoken one. Now, he had in mind the rather minor field of literary criticism, but his critique carried a much wider relevance then, and it still does today. And he finished with a stirring appeal. The last quotation: "We must," he said, "we must have free communication between the expert and the outsider, who may be an expert at something else, or the whole business of forward development and democracy will stop." Finally, and speaking for myself now, not through quotations, and referring to the title of this talk, this debate, I'm still hoping, and by the way, this is the only thing I want to say about the possible political knock-on effects of the economic fiasco, and really the only thing I feel qualified to say in this company. I'm still hoping that the economic crisis might yet force a political clarification in Britain. In a few months' time, we'll be marking 20 years since the fall of the Berlin Wall. My only thought then, that very heady late summer and autumn of 1989, at least the only thought I can remember having, was that from now on all the political arguments that matter would take place on the ground of liberalism. Now, we scoffed then, shortly afterwards, I think that winter, at the end of history claims, but in a sense Francis Fukuyama has been vindicated, I'm sorry to say. 10 years on, so 10 years ago, the lack of argument in Britain was loud. Today it's positively deafening. And for anyone who was politicised as I was in the 80s, or I would say earlier, this silence is the strangest thing. It's like tiptoeing around a church, which isn't a church at all, but a shopping mall or a football match. So a rebirth of political argument is long overdue.